Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be watching us today. This is part of our anatomy review series where we shall be focusing on the upper limb, everything about the upper limb. Our references for today are Netter's Anatomy as well as the Board's Review series anatomy textbook. Bear with me as we shall be writing a lot over the images which I shall be flashing in the next couple of slides. We will start with the bones of the shoulder girdle. This is the anterior view of the shoulder girdle, and this is the posterior view. Immediately noticeable here is the collarbone or the clavicle, which is a commonly fractured bone that forms the pectoral girdle together with the scapula over here. The clavicle connects the upper limb to the sternum, which is part of the axial skeleton, by articulating with the sternum at the sternoclavicular joint and with the acromion over here, the acromion of the scapula at the acromioclavicular joint. The clavicle is the first bone to begin ossification during fetal development, but it is the last one to complete ossification at approximately 21 years of age. It is also the only long bone to be ossified intramembranously, the clavicle. Next, we focus on the scapula, colloquially known as the shoulder blade, starting with the spine of the scapula. The spine over here, marked by a star, better appreciated posteriorly. The spine is a triangular shaped process that continues laterally as the acromion, and it divides into the upper supraspinous and the lower infraspinous fossae. The spine also provides an origin for the deltoid and an insertion for the trapezius muscle. Speaking of the acromion, this is the acromion on anterior and posterior view. The acromion is the lateral end of the spine of the scapula, and it articulates with the clavicle through what the acromioclavicular joint. The acromion is the origin for the deltoid and an insertion for the trapezius muscle. The coracoid process, seen over here as a protrusion, better seen anteriorly, the coracoid process, which we shall put a square over. It provides the origin for the coracobrachialis and biceps brachii, and it is the insertion of the pectoralis minor and the attachment site for the coracoclavicular, coracohumeral, and coracoacromial ligaments, and the costocoracoid membrane. The scapular notch over here, the scapular notch, better seen in posterior view, it is bridged by the superior transverse scapular ligament and converted into a foramen that transmits the suprascapular nerve. An important clinical correlate here is that calcification of the superior transverse scapular ligament may trap or compress the suprascapular nerve as it passes through the scapular notch. And when that happens, it can affect functions of the supraspinatus and the infraspinatus muscles. Calcifications of the superior transverse scapular ligament can trap or compress the suprascapular nerve as it passes through the scapular notch. We go down now inferiorly to the bones of the arm and the forearm, starting with the humerus. The humerus has a head which articulates with the scapula at the glenohumeral joint. The humerus has both an anatomic neck and a surgical neck. The anatomic neck, which is better seen here in a posterior view, which we shall mark with a marking over here, is an indentation distal to the head, and it provides an attachment for the fibrous joint capsule. The greater tubercle, which we shall mark with a star, lies just lateral and distal to the anatomic neck, and it is the attachment for the supraspinatus, infraspinatus, and teres minor muscles. Lying anteromedially to the greater tubercle is the lesser tubercle, which we shall mark with an asterisk. The lesser tubercle is the insertion for the subscapularis muscle. There is a depression between the greater and the lesser tubercles called the intertubercular groove, also known as the bicipital groove or sulcus, and it lodges the tendon of the long head of the biceps brachii muscle, and it is bridged by the transverse humeral ligament. The bicipital groove provides the insertion for the pectoralis major on its lateral tip, the teres major on its medial tip, and the latissimus dorsi on its floor. Going back now to the surgical neck. The surgical neck is a narrow area distal to the tubercles, which is a common site of fracture. And it is in contact with two important things. It is in contact with the axillary nerve and the posterior humeral circumflex artery, which we shall discuss in more detail shortly. Therefore, a fracture of the humeral surgical neck can compromise the axillary nerve as well as the posterior humeral circumflex artery. The deltoid tuberosity, moving now more inferiorly, is a rough triangular elevation on the lateral aspect of the midshaft of the humerus that marks the insertion of the deltoid muscle. Moving now more distally, we shall spend some time with the elbow joint. Seen here, marked by a star, is the trochlea. The trochlea is a spool-shaped medial articular surface found in the distal end of the humerus, which articulates with the trochlear notch of the ulna over here. Adjacent to the trochlea is the capitulum, again also a part of the distal end of the humerus. The capitulum is the lateral articular surface which articulates with the head of the radius. Therefore, trochlea articulates with the ulna and capitulum articulates with the radius. The olecranon fossa, better seen here in posterior view, is a posterior depression above the trochlea of the humerus that houses the olecranon of the ulna on full extension of the forearm. The coronoid fossa, better seen here anteriorly, is an anterior depression above the trochlea of the humerus that accommodates this time the coronoid process of the ulna when the elbow is flexed. The radial fossa, on the other hand, adjacent to the coronoid fossa, is an anterior depression above the capitulum that is occupied by the head of the radius during full extension of the elbow joint. We have two kinds of epicondyles in the distal end of the humerus, the lateral and the medial epicondyle. The lateral epicondyle projects from the capitulum and provides the origin of the supinator and extensor muscles of the forearm. Adjacent to the lateral epicondyle in the medial end, of course, is the medial epicondyle. The medial epicondyle projects from the trochlea and has a groove on the back for the ulnar nerve and superior ulnar collateral artery. It provides attachment sites for the ulnar collateral ligament, the pronator teres, and the common tendon of the forearm flexor muscles. The medial epicondyle is a common site of injury and even occasional fractures. And when the medial epicondyle is compromised, the ulnar nerve can likewise be affected. Moving now to the bones of the forearm itself, we start with the radius. The radius is actually shorter than the ulna and it is situated lateral to the ulna. The radius has a head, which is its proximal end, which articulates with the capitulum of the humerus and the radial notch of the ulna adjacent to it, and it is surrounded by the annular ligament. The distal end of the radius articulates with the proximal row of carpal bones or wrist bones, including the scaphoid, the lunate, and the triquetrum bones, but excluding the pisiform. Therefore, except for the pisiform, the scaphoid, lunate, and triquetral bones in the proximal carpal bone row articulates with the radius. The radial tuberosity over here, which we shall mark with a star, is an oblong prominence just distal to the neck, and it provides an attachment site for the biceps brachii tendon. The styloid process, moving again distally, we shall encircle over here, is located on the distal end of the radius, and it is approximately 1 centimeter distal to that of the ulna, and it provides insertion of the brachioradialis muscle. The styloid process can actually be palpated in the proximal part of the anatomic snuff box between the extensor pollicis longus and extensor pollicis brevis tendons. An important clinical correlation here is a fracture called Colles fracture. Colles fracture of the wrist is a distal radial fracture in which the distal fragment is displaced posteriorly, producing a characteristic bump described as a dinner or silver fork deformity. Because the forearm and the wrist resemble the shape of a dinner fork. But if the distal fragment is displaced anteriorly, it is called a reverse Colles fracture. A reverse Colles fracture being also called a Smith's fracture. So to recall, a Smith's fracture, the distal fragment is displaced anteriorly, but a Colles fracture, the distal fragment is displaced posteriorly. A Smith fracture may show styloid processes of the radius and ulna line up on a radiograph. Focusing now on the ulna, starting with the olecranon, which we shall mark with a star. The olecranon is the curved projection on the back of the elbow that provides an attachment site for the triceps tendon. Adjacent to it is the coronoid process located below the trochlear notch, and it provides an attachment site for the brachialis muscle. The trochlear notch receives the trochlea of the humerus, and the ulnar tuberosity, we are marking here with a line, is a roughened prominence distal to the coronoid process that provides an attachment site for the brachialis. The radial notch, moving now more inferiorly, accommodates the head of the radius at the proximal radio-ulnar joint. The head of the ulna is actually the distal end, and it articulates with the articular disc of the distal radio-ulnar joint, and it also has a styloid process. We focus now on the bones of the hand. The carpal bones or the wrist bones are arranged in two rows of four bones each. We have the first row, which is the proximal row of carpal bones, and the second row, which is the distal row of carpal bones. Arranged from lateral to medial, starting with the proximal row, we have the scaphoid, the lunate, the triquetrum, and the pisiform. And moving to the distal row, we have the trapezium, the trapezoid, the capitate, and the hamate. We have several mnemonic devices to remember the carpal bones, but one which we would like to use is Sandra likes to pat. This is the proximal row. Tom's two cold hands. This is the distal row. Again, the proximal row from lateral to medial, we have the scaphoid, the lunate, the triquetrum, and the pisiform. And except for the pisiform here, all of the proximal row carpal bones, they articulate with the radius and the articular disc. The pisiform is also special because it is said to be a sesamoid bone contained in the flexor carpi ulnaris tendon. And the distal row over here, from lateral to medial, we have the trapezium, the trapezoid, the capitate, and the hamate. The metacarpals, moving now even more distally, are miniature long bones consisting of bases in the proximal ends. They have a shaft or a body, and they also have heads, which are the distal ends. The heads of the metacarpals are the ones responsible for the knuckles. The phalanges, starting here, the phalanges are miniature long bones also, which likewise have a base, a shaft, and a head. The heads of the proximal and the middle phalanges form also the knuckles. We have three kinds of phalanges. We have the proximal phalanges, the middle phalanges, and finally the tips of our fingers, the distal phalanges. Some clinical correlations here. A fracture of the scaphoid bone occurs after a fall on an outstretched hand, and the manifestation is often a deep tenderness in the anatomic snuff box. The anatomic snuff box is this depression over here, and what happens is a scaphoid fracture is often accompanied by a damage of the radial artery, causing a vascular necrosis of the bone and degenerative joint disease of the wrist. A fracture of the hamate, on the other hand, a fracture of the hamate may injure the ulnar nerve and the ulnar artery because the ulnar nerve and ulnar artery are near the hook of the hamate. Bennett's fracture is another kind of fracture. It is a fracture of the base of the metacarpal of the thumb. So this is a location of Bennett's fracture. A boxer's fracture, another special kind of fracture, this time is a fracture of the necks of the second and the third metacarpals, seen in professional boxers, and typically of the fifth metacarpal in unskilled boxers. Boxer's fracture, fracture of the necks of the second and the third metacarpals, and even the fifth metacarpal. We focus specifically now on the shoulder joint, also known as the glenohumeral joint. And the shoulder or glenohumeral joint is actually a synovial ball and socket joint between the glenoid cavity of the scapula and the head of the humerus. Both articular surfaces are covered with hyaline cartilage. It is surrounded by a fibrous capsule that is attached superiorly to the margin of the glenoid cavity and inferiorly to the anatomic neck of the humerus. The capsule is reinforced by the rotator cuff over here, the glenohumeral ligaments, and the coracohumeral ligaments. The glenohumeral joint has a cavity that is deepened by the fibrocartilaginous labrum. It communicates with the subscapular bursa and allows abduction and adduction, flexion and extension, and even circumduction and rotation of the shoulder. There are three main nerve innervations for the shoulder joint. These are the axillary, suprascapular, and the lateral pectoral nerves. And the shoulder joint receives blood from branches of the suprascapular, anterior, and the posterior humeral, circumflex, and scapular circumflex arteries. An important clinical correlation here is that the shoulder joint may be and is commonly subject to inferior or anterior dislocation. Anterior dislocation is actually the most common kind of shoulder dislocation, wherein the fibrous capsule can be stretched and there can also be avulsion of the glenoid labrum and even injure the axillary nerve, which is adjacent the glenohumeral joint. The rotator, also known as the musculotendinous cuff, is formed by the tendons of four muscles. A common exam question: we have the tendons of the supraspinatus, which we shall mark with a star, the tendon of the infraspinatus, the teres minor, and finally the subscapularis. Our mnemonic here is SITS. The four tendons comprising the rotator cuff, the supraspinatus, infraspinatus, teres minor, and the subscapularis. So the teres major is not part of the rotator cuff. The rotator cuff fuses with the joint capsule and it provides shoulder mobility. Specifically, the rotator cuff keeps the head of the humerus in the glenoid fossa during movements and thus stabilizes the shoulder joint. Focusing now on the cutaneous nerves of the upper limb, it is easier to study the cutaneous nerves of the upper limb by adopting a proximal to distal fashion. Starting with the supraclavicular nerve, the supraclavicular nerve arises from the cervical plexus, C3 to C4, and it innervates the skin over the upper pectoral, deltoid, and outer trapezius areas. Moving distally, we have the medial brachial cutaneous nerve. The medial brachial cutaneous nerve arises from the medial cord of the brachial plexus, specifically C8 to T1, and it innervates the medial side of the arm. The medial antebrachial cutaneous nerve, even more distally, the medial antebrachial cutaneous nerve arises also from the medial cord of the brachial plexus, also C8 to T1, and it innervates the medial side of the forearm. Moving slightly superiorly, but laterally, we have the lateral brachial cutaneous nerve. The lateral brachial cutaneous nerve arises from the axillary nerve, specifically C5 to C6, and it innervates the lateral side of the arm. Moving distally, but still laterally, we have the lateral antebrachial cutaneous nerve. The lateral antebrachial cutaneous nerve arises from the musculocutaneous nerve, C6 to C7, and it innervates the lateral side of the forearm. The posterior brachial cutaneous and the antebrachial cutaneous nerves arise from the radial nerve, and they innervate the posterior sides of the arm and the forearm respectively. The intercostobrachial nerve is the lateral cutaneous branch of the second intercostal nerve emerging from the second intercostal space, and it may communicate with the medial brachial cutaneous nerve. We now move into the superficial veins of the upper limb. There are only a handful of important superficial veins for the upper limb, starting with the cephalic vein. The cephalic vein begins as the radial continuation of the dorsal venous network. It runs on the lateral side, and it is often connected with the basilic vein on the opposite end by the median cubital vein in front of the elbow. It ascends along the lateral surface of the biceps, piercing the brachial fascia, and it lies in the deltopectoral triangle with the deltoid branch of the thoracoacromial trunk. The cephalic vein pierces also the costocoracoid membrane of the clavipectoral fascia, and it will end here in the axillary vein. The basilic vein is located in the opposite medial end to the cephalic vein. The basilic vein arises from the dorsal venous arch of the hand, and it accompanies the median antebrachial cutaneous nerve along the ulnar border of the forearm, and it passes anterior to the medial epicondyle. It pierces the deep fascia of the arm and joins the brachial vein um, to form the axillary vein more proximally at the lower border of the teres major muscle. More distally is the median cubital vein, which is a connection between the cephalic vein and the basilic vein over the cubital fossa. The median cubital vein lies superficial to the bicipital aponeurosis, and thus it separates it from the brachial artery. The medial cubital vein is vulnerable to being punctured during intravenous injections and blood transfusions. The median antebrachial vein arises in the palmar venous network, ascending on the front of the forearm and terminates in the median cubital or the basilic vein. Finally, the dorsal venous network, though not shown here because it is in the opposite end, is a network of veins formed by the dorsal metacarpal veins that receive dorsal digital veins, and they continue proximally as the cephalic vein and the basilic vein. Finally, before we put this discussion to a close, a discussion of the superficial lymphatics of the upper limb. Starting again more distally to proximally, lymphatics of the finger drain into the plexuses on the dorsum and the palm of the hand, which form the medial and the lateral lymph vessels. The medial group of lymphatic vessels accompanies the basilic vein, passes through the cubital or the supratrochlear nodes, and they ascend to enter the lateral axillary nodes, which drain first into the central axillary nodes, which we are encircling here. And then, after passing through the central axillary nodes, the lymph passes into the apical axillary nodes. The lateral group of lymphatic vessels accompanies the cephalic vein, which, as we previously mentioned, is a lateral vein, and they drain into the lateral axillary nodes and also into the deltopectoral or infraclavicular nodes, which then drain into the apical nodes.